Hey there, everybody. Jeff Danlick here with Our Curious World, bringing you another story of the mysterious, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. Today we're going to look at an old story, and one that's over a century old, in fact, and one that's just as bizarre and controversial today as it was back then. And that is the amazing story of Patience Worth, the first ghostwriter that was literally a real ghost. So if you're ready, let's get into it. As an author on the paranormal, I've always been interested in ghosts. I've even written a couple of books on the subject, my most recent being slated for a September of 2026 release, in case you're interested. Though I've never personally seen one, I've always considered the prospect that the human personality may survive death to be a very real possibility, allowing for things like ghosts to exist. As such, I've always been intrigued by the case of Patience Worth, a supposed ghost that wrote many poems and several acclaimed novels from the other side. Sounds unlikely, you say? Well, let's look into it and see what we can find out. It all started in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, back in 1913, when a housewife by the name of Pearl Curran began receiving messages via a Ouija board from an entity that called itself Patience Worth, a supposed Puritan woman who lived in the 17th century, and one who emigrated to America, where she supposedly died at the hands of American Indians. Now, the idea that one might actually be in contact with such an entity, and via a simple parlor device like a Ouija board, no less, is not only remarkable and admittedly difficult to believe, but that was only the start of things. Not only did Mrs. Curran make contact with what could only be described as a ghost, but she was communicating with a very special ghost, for it seems that this Patience Worth was quite the literary phenomenon. Over the course of the next few years, she dictated to Mrs. Curran, initially through the Ouija board, but later through direct channeling, no less than 6 novels, several short stories, and hundreds of poems, some of which were critically acclaimed by literary critics at the time as being quite good, and in some cases, even classics. Of course, it would be only natural to assume that these writings were all the work of Mrs. Curran herself, an explanation that has been generally accepted by the science community. But there is one problem. Mrs. Curran was not a highly educated woman. In fact, she never finished high school beyond the 9th grade, and even more concerning, had never previously possessed any interest in or aptitude for writing. She actually desired to be a singer and spent much of her youth training for such an eventuality, which was never to be realized. And she also, by all accounts, had no real interest in the paranormal or Ouija boards, that device having been brought into her home by a friend who was trying to reach her own departed mother via the board and was seeking Mrs. Curran's help in doing so. What no one could dispute, however, was the quality and the quantity of the material Patience Worth produced over the span of the next 10 years or so, most of which was carefully transcribed by Mrs. Curran's dutiful husband John, who submitted the correspondence to various periodicals and publishers. Seeing the quality of the writing, they made their way into print and proved quite popular, which was a big feat back then, just as it would be today. While the writing trailed off somewhat after her husband's death in 1922 and the birth of her first child shortly thereafter, she continued to pursue Worth's writings as well as go on tour talking about Patience Worth. She was especially popular within the spiritual movements at the time, right up to the time of her death in 1937 at the age of 54. It was a death, by the way, the spirit of Patience Worth predicted a few weeks earlier, at a time when Mrs. Curran was still in good health. Okay, so what do we make of this fantastic story? Skeptics naturally claim that the whole thing was a complex hoax and one of astonishing complexity and longevity, and that Patience Worth was simply Pearl Curran's alter ego, representing itself as a long-dead Puritan woman. In other words, Pearl Curran, far from being the semi-literate and undereducated woman she is portrayed as being, was actually something of a literary savant of considerable talent, possibly even unbeknownst to Mrs. Curran herself. Well, I suppose this is a possibility and the only one available to the hardcore skeptic. it doesn't seem to leave a lot of questions. It does seem to leave a lot of questions unanswered. Foremost among them, is it possible that normal, average people could possess hidden talents within themselves that miraculously emerge under just the right conditions or under the most extraordinary circumstances, such as when playing with a Ouija board? I know that there are cases of savants who possess remarkable skills that defy explanation. For example, there's a young man by the name of Leslie Lemke. Though blind, possessing a very limited mental capability, is capable of playing any song on a piano after hearing it only once, and this despite never having received any formal training on the piano or as a musician at all. There are also savants who possess phenomenal memories or are capable of producing great works of art, which have intrigued scientists for years. So is Pearl Curran one of these people? Well, first, savants, besides being exceedingly rare, almost always possess serious intellectual disabilities or limitations, or have acquired their abilities after suffering some kind of a brain injury, neither of which appear to apply to Pearl Curran. Additionally, savants don't claim that their enhanced capabilities are derived from some external force like God or spirit guides, but seem to arise quite spontaneously and appear to be something entirely physiological in nature. For such capabilities to suddenly appear in a normal person who has not received a brain injury or is intellectually disabled is unheard of. As a published author myself, I can assure you that writing saleable fiction, especially publishable poetry, which is something I don't try, takes years of practice. It's not something that someone has residing within their brain like a hidden computer program that spontaneously bursts forth if the right combination of keys are pressed. For a person with only a limited education and no prior interest or aptitude for writing to produce competent poetry or well-developed fiction is almost impossible. Even the most successful authors will tell you that their earliest work was garbage, and many didn't become best-selling authors until after many years of practice, and with many early failures to their credit. Yet we are expected to believe that Pearl Curran was somehow able to circumvent all of this to become an overnight literary success, which I personally find almost impossible to accept. Consider what it is that the skeptic is proposing, that they're just wanting us to accept that without question. Here is a woman with no writing experience, no knowledge of advanced sentence structure, grammar, plotting, and pacing, and apparently no appreciable interest in the craft of writing itself. And suddenly she has novels in the bookstores and poetry being printed in various periodicals without as much as a single rejection letter from a publisher. That would be quite a feat, even if Patience Worth were some kind of alter ego Mrs. Curran had invented out of thin air. Okay, so could the idea that Pearl Curran was not as academically challenged as her biography would seem to suggest a lie? In other words, might she have had more talent and ability than she let on, and used the whole Patience Worth persona as a sort of cover story, a pseudonym, if you will, she used to cover her own insecurities? Possibly, but why do that? If she truly was capable of writing well enough to get consistently published and even applauded for her abilities, why make up such an elaborate story? Remember, her husband transcribed her channelings for years, often in front of other witnesses, which would seem to be an awfully ponderous way of writing. Plus, how would she be able to do edits or revisions to the material she channeled, a vital element to any successful prose? And finally, if one were to experience considerable success taking this route, wouldn't you eventually want credit for it? I'd think that once her talent became known to the literary world, she would drop the whole Patience Worth facade and publish her future works under her own name. I know for damn sure I would. Okay, so where does that leave us? Either Pearl Curran was a savant who manufactured this Patience Worth persona, either unknowingly or as a way of hiding her true talents for some reason, or she was receiving literary material from some external source. If the latter, however, well, what do we mean by an external source? To be more precise, could Patience Worth really have been a ghost? So who exactly was this Patience Worth, and did she really exist, at least at one time? Skeptics are quick to point out that there is no record of such a person being recorded as having lived in either England or America in the 17th century, and so assume such a woman never existed. Of course, how good was record keeping over 300 years ago? especially among what would be thought of at the time as the peasantry. How many birth records, marriage certificates, death notices would survive that long? The fact that there is no record of a patient's worth is of no surprise to me. In fact, I would find it both astonishing and even a little suspicious if such a record could be found. Another issue skeptics point out is one of the novels Worth supposedly dictated takes place in Victorian times, an era that occurred in the last half of the 19th century and some 200 years after Patience Worth's untimely death. If that's the case, then how could she pen a story that takes place in an era that she never personally experienced? Well, this would seem to be a major problem. It works on the assumption that once a person dies, their spirit is essentially locked into that time period. But is that necessarily the case? Could a spirit potentially observe history from the other side and so essentially stay up to date about changing cultures and times, and then simply weave what it observes into a fictional story? Since ghosts are thought by some to be essentially trapped in the physical realm to some degree, wouldn't they naturally be aware of the passage of time since they are still attached to it? Assuming that such a thing as ghosts exists, and since we know so little about how they operate, such has to be at least considered a possibility. However, there is another idea to consider. What if Patience Worth wasn't a ghost of a human being at all, but the spirit of some kind of other disembodied intelligence that was simply using Worth as a pseudonym? It may not have even been a human at all, but an interdimensional being of considerable intellectual power that was simply afforded the opportunity of expressing itself through Mrs. Curran's dalliance with the aforementioned Ouija board. Of course, some might be tempted to suggest that this could have been a demonic entity, but it's not clear how it was detrimental to either society or Mrs. Curran personally. One would think that a demonic spirit would be more inclined to sow fear rather than spend its time writing beautiful poetry and well-regarded historical novels, but then who really knows what demons might like to do in their spare time? Another possibility, and one I've never seen presented, is that Patience Worth was not a ghost or a demon, but an echo from Mrs. Curran's own past. In other words, could Patience Worth have been one of Pearl Curran's earlier incarnations that was somehow capable of working through her current incarnation to express itself? Let's consider this idea for a moment. Suppose this prior incarnation, this young girl who called herself Patience Worth, was a brilliant but frustrated author herself, but one due to the circumstances of her birth and likely lack of formal education due to her status as a lowly commoner, never had the chance to express herself artistically during that lifetime. Eventually, however, one of that soul's later incarnations, in this case one Pearl Curran, afforded her the opportunity to at last express her creative abilities, which she took full advantage of. But where did she get her knowledge of Victorian times, which served as the basis for one of her novels, when she did not live in that era herself? Obviously, she got it from Mrs. Curran, who was born in 1883 and grew up during that era. Patience then would simply incorporate Mrs. Curran's recollections of that era into her works of fiction, gleaning the necessary information from her fellow reincarnated persona. In effect, then, Pearl Curran really was the force behind Patience Worth, but not in the way skeptics imagine. Patience Worth wasn't an alter ego or the creation of some repressed savant genius, but the voice of a frustrated previous incarnation that was suddenly given the opportunity to express itself in a way few such past incarnations ever have the chance to do. Naturally, all of this is highly speculative, but if Patience Worth was a past life echo from Pearl Curran's past, it would explain why she was able to write historical fiction set in an era that occurred centuries after her death. Again, that's largely speculation on my part, but it does answer some questions rather nicely, doesn't it? Of course, this begs the question of why, if this was the case, the previous incarnation didn't just integrate its talents into the persona known as Pearl Curran and write from her more modern perspective. After all, reincarnationists often maintain that we retain many of our fears and traumas from our previous incarnations and bring them into our current life. So why couldn't we also bring previous past life talents and abilities into our current incarnation as well? Well, perhaps we do. But in Mrs. Curran's case, the past life persona wanted to retain its individuality, rather than simply merge that personality, along with its many talents and potentials, into Mrs. Curran's persona. Perhaps the previous incarnation was so frustrated that it had been denied an outlet for its creativity during its rather mundane previous lifetime that it wanted to make a statement that only Mrs. Curran's use of a Ouija board allowed her to do. On the other hand, maybe the previous incarnation knew that Mrs. Curran lacked the education or talent to bring her stories to fruition, so she decided to do it herself. Who knows how disembodied past life personas act nowadays? So what do you think? Was Patience Worth merely an invention created in the mind of an ordinary early 20th century housewife from St. Louis? Or was she the ghost of a long-dead woman from England with a long-suppressed gift for writing? Or could she have been some other sort of spiritual entity using Patience Worth as a cover story? Or perhaps even a demon with a penchant for writing poetry? Or for that matter, could she have been the voice from a previous incarnation that had at last finally found a willing outlet for its creativity? You decide, but wherever you land on the issue, it should be enough to help you appreciate that ours truly is a curious world. Say, if you like this video, I'd really appreciate if you could hit that like button and consider subscribing to see more stories like this from our curious world. I'm new to YouTube and really need your help to get this channel to grow, so I can bring you more wacky, weird, and bizarre stuff like this. Hey, here's your final thought for the day. I don't worry about growing old and dying. I just worry that next time I might come back as an accountant. Till next time, bye.